While I was getting ready for my talk today, Emily remarked on how quickly it all came together. And what I said was, I've spent the last 50 years writing it. What I want to talk about today is both wisdom and innocence and the apparent rub between them, and how we, or at least many of us, go on a long three-stage journey in resolving the seeming tension between them. So let's first look at a definition of our terms. In this definition, innocence means 1A, freedom from legal guilt of a particular crime or offense. B, freedom from guilt or sin through being unacquainted with evil, blamelessness. C, lack of knowledge, ignorance. D, freedom from guile, or D1, freedom from guile or cunning, simplicity. And D2, lack of worldly experience or sophistication. And if you note, there are kind of two themes that run through several of these definitions. The first is what we usually think of as innocence: freedom from evil, malicious, hurtful intent in one's actions. But two, there's another very important dimension, and that is being unaware of evil. 1B says unacquainted with evil. 1C says lack of knowledge. D2 says lack of worldly experience. So there's a lack of awareness of evil there. Okay, so let's look at wisdom. Turns out there's no single definition that's accepted by everyone of wisdom, but here's a definition I cobbled together from a lot of different definitions. Wisdom is deep understanding and knowledge gained from experience and experts, which enables one to deal with complex questions of life and exercise sound judgment in practical affairs. And again, here, there seem to be two main dimensions. I even heard them described as wit and virtue. So, number one, you see deeply into life. There's a deep understanding of life that we think of as wisdom. But two, that results in you making decisions that are sound, that are reasonable, that are constructive, and that are virtuous, that are for the common good. So they're seeing deeply into life and making sound decisions. Okay, so overall, with wisdom, you are seeing and engaging with life as it is. And it's not hard to see there's an obvious tension between the two. In innocence, you see no evil. In wisdom, you see life as it is. And if you can even think of that final definition of innocence, lack of worldly experience or sophistication, well, that basically amounts to lack of wisdom. So the two qualities, both deeply desirable, seem to not go together. And I think somewhere inside we sense that. We want to be both innocent, both pure and good, and we want to be wise, but it seems impossible to be both at the same time. How can you be unacquainted with evil and engage with life as it is? The Course, however, promises that you can. It says that you can have perfect innocence and perfect wisdom at the same time. You can be 100% innocent while being 100% wise. And in fact, the Course says that in their fullest form, each one is the other. And we'll get to that. However, I think reaching that stage is a long journey. And along the way, I think that a lot of us go through two preliminary stages, and we'll be talking about these at length. Number one, the first stage is partial innocence. Second stage is partial wisdom. So, one, partial innocence, two, partial wisdom. I get this three-stage idea, stage three being the ultimate endpoint where wisdom and innocence are one, from a section in chapter three of the text called Innocent Perception. It talks about what I'm calling stage one, it talks about stage three, and then I think filling in stage two, partial wisdom, is just logical at that point. I doubt that everyone goes through these stages in this order, but I think a lot of us do. And I know I have been. So I hope you can relate to these three stages. Let's start with partial innocence. This is how we start out life. And I don't mean that we start out without harmful intentions. Like when you think about the innocence of children, children are not without harmful intentions. They've got a surprising abundance of such intentions. But they tend to show that second kind of innocence, unawareness of evil in the world. If you grow up in a relatively calm and stable household, you tend to grow up wearing rose colored glasses. The world is this orderly place of law and justice. Everyone has good intentions. The world is full of princesses and knights in shining armor. There is the occasional evil genius, but they are always defeated. The good guys always win. Santa Claus magically slides down your chimney. The tooth fairy shows up to give you money for your teeth. The Easter bunny delivers chocolate eggs. And most of us try to actively give our kids this view. Okay. I was always very ambivalent about it, but I kind of went along with the whole project. We want them to feel safe. And if they were exposed at a very young age to the full brunt of the way things really are here, they would feel afraid. I remember when I was about 5, and on a total whim, I decided to turn on the news, the evening news on the TV, sitting by myself, watching the news very happily. And my dad wandered in, saw me watching the news, and got very angry, like surprisingly openly angry. And he said, "You don't want to watch that." And he walked over and turned it off, and not having a clicker, you know, I that was that. I had no idea why. I thought for years about why he was so adamant. I did not watch the news, but I get it now. We want to shield our kids. Obviously, though, we slowly wake up and we realize that the knights in shining armor and the princesses and the world itself are a lot more corrupt than we ever would have guessed. That it's really a jungle out there where law and order are kind of a veneer that covers over the fact that it's all chaos, that the strong prey on the weak, and, you know, it's a mess. That we're making our way not through this heroic fairy tale, but through a cold and scary place. I think, though, that for many of us, we hit a second childhood when we get into spirituality. And that was definitely true in my case. And in this second childhood, you are determined to be as pure and innocent and spiritual as possible, to see the world in the most rosy, optimistic way you can. I remember in my 20s, me and the spiritual seekers I was living with were putting on this yard sale. We were trying to live simpler lives. We had a ton of stuff to sell. And at the same time, we were just too pure to put prices on anything. So there were literally no price stickers. And we would just ask people, what is it worth to you? And of course, everyone was totally confused. A lot of people were trying to barter with us, trying to feel like they've gotten one over on us and they won in the exchange. And we just wouldn't do it. So whatever they offered to pay was what they got it for. And it was a crazy and unforgettable day. They were so confused and we were so adamant. We thought we were being so good. I think we know that kind of innocence. And Jesus, I think, was talking about people just like me when he said in this passage from the section that I'm drawing from, innocence is also not a partial attribute. It is not a real defense until it is total. When it is partial, it is characterized by the same erratic nature that holds for other two-edged defenses. And here's the line: the partly innocent are apt to be quite stupid at times. I mean, Jesus is not mincing any words here. It is not until their innocence is a genuine viewpoint, which is universal in its application, that it becomes wisdom. So the partly innocent are apt to be quite stupid at times. And we know exactly what he means, right? He means they're apt to be unwise. They're apt to make unsound decisions that go against their own best interests. Their innocence, in other words, gets them into trouble. Notice, though, that the problem is that their innocence is partial. We think the problem is they're too innocent. But he implies that the problem is they're not innocent enough. Isn't that interesting? And that when their innocence becomes total, it will also be wisdom. But we're a long way from that. Got another stage to go through first. So let's talk about that second stage after partial innocence becomes partial wisdom. I think that for most of us, life experiences add up. We go through what we call the school of hard knocks, and we pass from that partial innocence into what we could call partial wisdom. This is where we get very clear-eyed about how the world actually works. We take off those rose-colored glasses and we face the jungle in all its chaos. I'll speak for myself. I went through a long process of shedding a great many of my former perspectives. I believed, for instance, that humanity was about to enter this glorious new age of natural living and spiritual enlightenment until all the dates that were prophesied came and went, and I slowly realized the world just doesn't work that way. I also shed this belief. I thought kids were like born with this beautiful spiritual innocence, and that the key thing was just to never squash that by saying no. So what I did was I never said no. I said out of bounds. And out of bounds meant no. But by not saying no, I was not squashing that natural spiritual vitality that just needed to flow out of them, although there were a lot of other things flowing out of them. I thought that I would spend my life in a spiritual enclave with pure and innocent spiritual seekers like me, away from the unspiritual world, where we would live in a paradise of love and cooperation on earth, until I slowly realized that we were just like everyone else. We had formed this haven to get away from the ego, but it had just followed us in. I could go on and on with a long list of the changes I've gone through, all sounding just like those. It's been a long, slow awakening to the world as it is for me, and not always a happy one. It's nice to believe in that more innocent world, but I'm not willing to live in that naive state of innocence anymore. However, this stage of what I'm calling partial wisdom, it comes at a cost. One is you get jaded, right? You look out at the world, you see egos running the show everywhere, in private life and in public life. On the personal level, you get used to the fact that, and this is what I feel I've observed, most people are not going to live from the highest in them. Even when it comes to basic matters of life direction, most people, even most spiritual seekers, are going to go with their egos. And then on the collective level, you see egos in control in government, in corporations, in religion, in science, in the arts, in literally every area of life. And you see the poverty and war and environmental degradation that results, and you get jaded. Also, obviously, this stage, partial wisdom, comes with a lot of fear and depression. Think of how many of us are afraid and worried to the point of loss of sleep over what's happening in the world today. Am I going to wake up tomorrow and find out that my country has destroyed a civilization? Another problem with this stage is that it lacks innocence. It is, after all, just full of judgment. You can't look out on all those egos running the show without some judgment, without usually a lot of judgment. You have the comfort of knowing that you're facing the world more honestly, but there's a sourness inside over all the judgment and condemnation in your own mind. And there's one final problem with this stage, and that is that, ironically, it also lacks wisdom. Why is that? You're trying your utmost to face life as it is without sugarcoating it. The reason is wisdom involves seeing deeply into life. And at this stage, you're really only seeing the surface. It's true that you're seeing beneath the topmost surface, and the topmost surface is where every living thing is advertising its benefits and its goodness, and it's going to be so great for you. And even nature does this, right? The billboards do this, all the commercials do this. And you're seeing in this current stage beneath that, but you're seeing just a slightly deeper surface beneath that. You haven't gone down to the real depths. And so at some point, the disadvantages of this stage, partial wisdom, become too much. The jadedness, the fear and depression, the judgment, the lack of innocence, and the lack of true wisdom all add up. And we set out for the third stage. And this third stage, we can call innocent wisdom. We could call it perfect innocence and perfect wisdom, but you get the basic idea. Okay. This is where innocence becomes total and wisdom becomes total, so that innocence becomes wisdom. And let's talk about how that takes place. We're in the same section, innocent perception. And here's what it says about this stage. It says the atonement epitomizes harmlessness and sheds only blessing. It could not do this if it arose from anything other than perfect innocence. Innocence is wisdom because it is unaware of evil, which does not exist. It is, however, perfectly aware of everything that is true. Let me just go through this a little bit. The atonement, it says, can only epitomize harmlessness and shed blessing because it arises from perfect innocence. I think we all know perfect innocence is harmless and only blesses. But notice he's talking about perfect innocence, not partial innocence. And then he resolves the tension that has pervaded the entire journey as I've been laying it out. He says innocence is wisdom, not innocence and wisdom are incompatible, not we must balance wisdom and innocence. Rather, he says innocence is wisdom. How can that be? If we look very closely, we will notice he answers it in the very sentence we're talking about, where he says, because it, innocence, is unaware of evil, which does not exist. So innocence, by definition, we saw in the dictionary, is unaware of evil. That's part of what the word means. But wisdom, is also unaware of evil. Why? Because wisdom sees what is really there, and evil is not really there. It does not really exist. So both innocence and wisdom are unaware of evil. And that means innocence is wisdom. In their perfect form, they are both the same thing. And he then ends the passage by saying that innocence is, quote, however, perfectly aware of everything that is true. And then in the next paragraph, he says that innocent or true perception means that you never see what does not exist in reality. So now we've had two sides to what he's calling innocent or true perception. One, you don't see what does not exist in reality. So you don't see what does not exist, which means you don't see evil. And two, you do see what is true. So what is it that you see instead of evil? And then we'll see this on the next quote. So in the same section, he says, if nothing but the truth exists, and this is really redundant in statement because what is not true cannot exist, right-minded seeing cannot see anything but perfection. We have said many times that only what God creates and what you create, meaning in heaven, with the same will, has any real existence. This then is all that the innocent can see. So when innocence and wisdom become total, when innocence becomes wisdom, number one, you never see evil. Number two, you only see perfection. You never see evil, you only see perfection, which sounds wonderful, right? That would be total peace of mind. But the immediate and obvious question is, how is that possible? You never see evil, you only see perfection. It sounds like denial. Okay. But I think there is a simple answer to this question. And I want to talk about using the imagery in this passage from the workbook. So let's really look at this. It says, let go all the trivial things that churn and bubble on the surface of your mind and reach down and below them to the kingdom of heaven. There is a place in you where there is perfect peace. So I think you probably get the image here. We're talking about a surface that churns and bubbles. And then below it lies these depths where there is perfect peace. He's talking about water, right? He's talking about something like the ocean, where you have a choppy surface, and down below that are the peaceful depths. And this image of a churning surface versus quiet depths can be our handle for understanding how we can see perfection in a world that is so obviously imperfect. So this is my attempt to tease out of ChatGPT an illustration of the passage we just saw, although I asked it to turn the waves into people just to make it a bit more descriptive of what we're talking about. And this is what the Course is saying about all of us, right? On the surface is ego, but that's just the surface. Down below lie the depths where there is no evil and there is nothing but perfection. Furthermore, the Course says that this surface is not only just the topmost surface, the Course is saying it's not even real. So the only thing real are those peaceful depths where there is just perfection. So now imagine that you're looking at a person, and let's say it's a person who you know who seems just trapped in their ego. You see them behaving counterproductively and even destructively, and they're stubborn about it. Okay, they just won't change. Meanwhile, they maintain they're doing everything right, and any fault in the situation is, of course, yours. Now, when you are in a situation like that, with a person like that, what happens is what is their ego and what their ego does fills your vision. That's all you can see when you look at that person. Maybe they're one of these guys in the center, you know, all you can see is what's going on the surface. But now imagine saying to yourself that that's just what is churning and bubbling on the surface. Below that are the quiet depths in that person. And in those depths, there is no ego. There is no evil. There's nothing but shining perfection. The perfection of who they are as God created them, not as they made themselves. And that level, the quiet depths below, that's the only thing that's real. What churns and bubbles on the surface is not real. It's like a mirage hovering above the pavement. Now, in this picture, where should your focus go? If the depths are 99% of the ocean, and if the 1% on the top is merely an illusion, why wouldn't your focus be on the depths? Likewise, where would your emotions go? Your emotional response. Wouldn't your emotional response be a response to the depths, to their perfection? And this can be our response to the world as a whole. It can be individuals and it can be everyone. We can read the news and see all the conflict and the chaos out there. That's the surface level. And we can tell ourselves that's just what is churning and bubbling on the surface. Below that, in the quiet depths, there is no evil. There's nothing but perfection. We can just realize there is countless perfect God created minds behind the human bodies and the animal bodies and the plant bodies, and that perfection is the only thing that is real. That is who all those beings really are. And even though they are asleep to their perfection, they are all on a journey towards realizing it, a glorious journey that's being overseen by God and the Holy Spirit, and that's guaranteed to succeed. Okay, you can take the slide down now. Now, if those quiet depths where there's no evil and only perfection is the reality of the world, it's what the Course calls the real world or the world's reality, what would our emotional response be to the world? Obviously, it would be incredibly positive. Our response to the world would be one of love and joy. How else would you respond to the sight of perfection? Now, obviously, objections come up here. One objection is, but aren't things particularly bad on the surface these days? And it's true. They do seem particularly bad right now. I mean, I mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, it sounds like my country threatened to annihilate another country, apparently with nuclear bombs. It's true that the churning and bubbling surface can get very stormy at times. And to go back to our ocean metaphor, you hear about 100-foot ocean waves. Okay, they do happen, 100 feet tall, massive waves. But the average depth of the ocean is 12,000 feet. And so a 100-foot wave, enormous as it seems, is actually less than 1% of the total depth of the ocean. It's a small part of the picture. Another objection is that this view that only perfection is real leads to being naive about what's happening on the surface. I don't think it does. I think what leads to being naive about the surface is stage one. Okay. I think here at stage three, we are more realistic and more rational about what's going on the level of form. And we see this with how Jesus talks in the Course. He is entirely sober and clear eyed about what goes on the surface. Okay. For instance, his view of nature is anything but rosy and romantic. He acknowledges that everything in nature lives by eating everything else. He says, quote, devouring is nature's law of life. He says, one of my favorite examples, that those who came after Freud tried to endow the ego with the attributes of the spirit, tried to see the ego in much more rosy and romantic terms. And you'd think, oh, well, that must be the Course's point of view. But then Jesus says, Freud was more clear sighted about this because he knew a bad thing when he perceived it. So Jesus does not have rose colored glasses. He sees what's going on at the surface, but he mainly sees those perfect depths below. How do we reach this perspective? I think the Course makes clear we get there by just reminding ourselves all the time that the reality beneath the surface is perfection. The reality of the person who is criticizing us is perfection. The reality of the corrupt person who is in a position of authority is perfection. The reality of that stranger we see on the street is perfection. The reality of the world beneath the surface is perfection. We get there by, no matter what happens, just returning our attention again and again and again to the perfection below the surface. And we know when we've reached this place, when our focus is more on that perfection than on the ego that churns and bubbles on the surface. And we know we've reached that place when our emotional reaction to everyone and to the world as a whole is pure joy. Because how else would you respond to perfection? At that point, our lifelong struggle between innocence and wisdom will be over. We will be perfectly innocent because we will be unaware of evil anywhere. And we will be perfectly wise because we will truly see into the depths of things where evil does not exist. We will, in the words of Jesus, have at last joined the ranks of the right-minded who cannot see anything but perfection.